Our first lecture, we will do basic introduction to macroeconomics. Unfortunately, with all the excitement about the first lecture, and I'm having a major visitor over here, I had a nice outline, which was a plan of what we're supposed to do, and with all the rush and hurry with technology, video, etc., I forgot the outline, so you guys will be, at least those of you who had economics, my assistants. So first point is economics. Economics. What is economics? And economics has, or we can see economics in very many different ways. The first way to see economics is the science of scarcity. This is a somewhat non-standard definition, but it is probably the best definition for the subject of economics. Economics is the subject of scarcity. If something is scarce, meaning that people want it and it is a relatively limited supply, then it is the subject of economics. Back in the old days, so let's say centuries ago, when there was plenty of fish and fish was abundant and no one felt that fish was scarce, fish was not subject of economics, it was subject of other things. Fresh water would be another example that was back in the old days, centuries or millennia ago, fairly abundant. Today, fresh water becomes relatively scarce. So these two are examples of something that, being historically relatively abundant, now has become relatively scarce. It becomes a subject of economics. These two are examples of resource economics. So practically, we can say that another scarce resource, which is always present in economics, is time. Time is always present. Therefore, time is also, by definition, a subject of economics. Any questions on scarcity? So, essentially what I'm trying to do, okay, let me backtrack a little bit, is before the first time I spent 4 weeks, about 2 years ago, on this introductory stuff. Last year I spent 2 weeks on this introductory stuff. Essentially, I'm planning to spend today only 30 or 40 minutes and be done with it and move on straight to macroeconomics. So, economics number 1 is about scarcity. Economics number 2 is about decision making. Decision making. So, economics is the subject of how people make decisions, how they make rational and economic decisions. So this is the second way or alternative way to think about economics. Of course, the decisions are always related to some scarce resource. It could be money, it could be a textbook, it could be a laptop, something that is relatively scarce. So, people make decisions. Economics is about how individuals, businesses, etc., how people make decisions. Rational and economic at that. Any questions? Alright. An alternative way or view, which is not too different, which is what, let's say, the Austrian School of Economics ascribes, is that economics is about human action. And human action is essentially about how people behave. So, it is about economic behavior. So, how people behave. What you have to understand is that this is a slightly different version and effectively means how people make decisions. Alright? Well, let's say you decided to come and enroll in this class. So it is about how you make the decision, why you made the decision. So another thing about decisions is related to certain costs, and related to certain benefits. So the costs are time, effort, etc. Benefits are learning the subject of macroeconomics, understanding macroeconomics, which of course is the goal of our class by the end of the semester. That's as simple and as basic a goal that I have, is that you guys understand basically what macroeconomics is, how it works, etc. So it is cost-benefit. Now, an alternative way to cost-benefit, which is more or less equivalent, is simply said with different words, which microeconomists like to use, is inputs and outputs. So, an alternative way to think is what you gotta input into something and what you get out in return. Of course, when you input something, you always want to get more, alright? So that's effectively what decision making and what human action or economic behavior is all about. Another fundamental concept in economics is related to efficiency. And the easiest and simplest, still very correct way to think about it is how, given a certain inputs, you get the maximum output. So, whenever you're getting the maximum output out of given inputs, we call it efficient. We call it efficient production, efficient allocation. In other words, there is efficiency. The alternative way to think about efficiency is, in an attempt to achieve certain outputs, what is the minimum amount of inputs necessary for that goal? So, here's how I use the word goal. So, goals slash objectives. So, you have goals and objectives, and goals and objectives are, of course, related to outputs, and they are, of course, related to benefits. It's the same old concept of trying to accomplish something, and the relevant concept here for goals and objectives is resources. So, we use certain resources. By definition, for the subject of economics, these resources are always scarce. If the resources are not scarce, they're not the subject of economics. An example would be ocean salt water. Ocean salt water is extremely abundant, to the point that nobody perceives it as scarce, and therefore is not technically the subject of economics. Now, the fish in it and all the, the marine life in it is subject of economics because it's scarce. But ocean water per se is not scarce. There's plenty of it, and anyone can get as much as they want. So, scarce resources. Another word which is often used for resources, which is the same as input, is means. So, means is the same as resources, something that you have and that you use in order to accomplish certain goals or certain objectives. So this is means. So that's more or less the first part on the basics of economics. Of course, basics of economics in 15 minutes is relatively insufficient, but as I said, you're expected to have done some micro and fundamentals on your own in the previous semester or on your own. Let's see any questions that you have on point number 1 before I move to my next point. Any questions on economics? None. Alright, now we move to the difference between macroeconomics and microeconomics. So, microeconomics is about how individuals and businesses make decisions. So, it is about the decision making of individuals and businesses. Microeconomists also like to call businesses firms. So, business is the same as firm or firms. So, this is what microeconomics is about. How an individual makes a decision. Now, with an individual, we have that intermediate group, which is often an actual subject that will be the family. So, the family act as one unit. Now, the question for us, of course, is what macroeconomics is about. Meaning, this is the subject for the rest of this semester. And the subject is about the big picture. The subject is about how the economy behaves in general. More specifically, it is about the things that people care the most. One thing that people care about the most is employment. Are there jobs or is there unemployment? Meaning, are people able to find jobs easily? We're going to have about half, most likely, one full 75-minute lecture on employment, respectively unemployment. Employment is having or ability to get a job, and unemployment is inability to get or find a job at the prevailing wages. So, people care about jobs. The other thing that people care about are prices, which for now at least we will simply call inflation. I will have a one full complete 75-minute lecture on inflation separately. So inflation is something else that we care about. A third major component or worry or let's say subject of macroeconomics is interest rates. Interest rates. So the interest rates is the price of money. One way to think about it is the rental price of money. If you borrow or rent $100 today, how much rent, meaning interest, you must have to pay 1 year from now? Is it 6%, 7%, or 9%? Similarly, or the same as when you buy a house and you get a mortgage on a house, are you going to be paying 5% or 10%? Makes a world of difference. So, another very important is the government's fiscal position, simply known or better known as the budget. The government budget or sometimes the fiscal budget. how much the government spends and how much the government taxes people. How? So it is about the fiscal policy. Fiscal policy simply means how and how much revenues the government raises through taxation and the way it spends it. As I have indicated, the very last lecture, which is our 12th point, is on government spending and fiscal policy. There is another very important subject in macroeconomics, and this is productivity. Productivity simply means with a given amount of resources, how much output you get. The more output you can get with a given resources, of course, the more productive one is. This relates to firms and this relates to businesses. With productivity turns out to be the major determinant of wages and wage levels. In other words, how much on average Bulgarian people get in terms of wages. So what's the average wages and salaries in Bulgaria is fundamentally determined entirely by the productivity. Again, I'm not talking about person A or person B. I'm talking about the average for the whole economy and respectively the productivity of the whole economy. Apparently, if, let's say, Germans are getting 4 times higher salaries, meaning their salaries have 4 times higher purchasing power, it must be the case that their productivity is 4 times higher. And there is one last subject of macroeconomics, which is the value of the currency. It is the most complicated of all questions in macroeconomics, and it is effectively has a subject of its own called international finance. So within international economics, you have 2 fields, international trade and international finance. International finance has as a focus the subject of the value of the currency. So what we will be focusing in macroeconomics is mostly these 5 major issues. And the next big thing is how they relate to each other. How they relate to each other means how rising or falling unemployment affects prices, or how rising interest rates affect the fiscal position or productivity. Essentially, the basic questions in macroeconomics is how, given a change in one of these variables, affects the rest. So that's the one basic question in macroeconomics. The other is how these variables change over time, and that change over time is called the business cycle. As I have indicated, I plan, that's the hardest and actually the best part of macroeconomics, to spend roughly 4 weeks, between 3 and 4 weeks, more like 8 lectures on business cycles. This is at the very end of the semester. So, essentially what the business cycle does is tie these variables together over time. How one rises and another rises, or another may possibly fall. So, this is what macro is, and this is how it is different from microeconomics. Any questions on this topic, macro versus microeconomics? Anything? No. All right. One other point that I want to, let me see where, let's do this here, is what economists love to do, both in microeconomics and in macroeconomics, and this is called modeling. So modeling, and therefore we have economic models. Of course, in life, in every science, there are usually models. So in economics, we have economic models. So economic models have certain basic features. One of the features of an economic model is so-called economic theory. Usually an economic model underlies an economic theory, or is a short expression between different economic variables. One example of an economic theory or of an economic model is the relationship between increase in the money supply and inflation, meaning rising prices. In other words, one of the basic relationships in macroeconomics is that if the government prints more money, the prices will be rising faster. This is a simple economic model that relates money supply or printing of money with rising prices. Another example will be employment and inflation. As unemployment comes lower and lower and lower, meaning that more and more people work and they get higher and higher wages and more wages through the economy, demand rises, and this may possibly, usually, drive inflation. So, simple relationship, what happens when this changes, how that variable changes. So, I use the key word variable. So, every model has variables. So, a variable in mathematics, as in economics, is something that can be measured. So, unemployment, you can simply measure 2,055,000 unemployed, or price, as in price inflation. This month, prices rose 2.1%, for example. Or interest rates are currently, at least in the United States, the 10-year interest rate, or the interest rate on a 10-year government bond, is 3.6%. So, it is measurable. You can measure it at a certain point, or for a certain period, and we call it variable. Sometimes we have in economic models typically input variables and we have output variables. Alright? So every economic model has necessarily variables. Let's see what else. Every economic model also has assumptions. So, assumption is a key and always present ingredient of a model, and it relates to what economists assume, which means take for given or take for granted during their economic analysis or during their economic theory. So, when the government prints or increases the money supply by 10%, prices rise roughly by 10%. We simply assume that interest rates remain unchanged, or we simply assume that the government does not increase its budget deficits. So, usually the assumptions are in economics explicitly written, and from all the assumptions in economics, there is one assumption that is most popular, that economists love, and it is called ceteris paribus, which simply means all other things equal, or all other things remaining the same, or all other things remaining constant, or all other things remaining unchanged. So, essentially, assumptions are always present, and the inherent assumption, usually in economic modeling, is that all other things remain the same. I mean, in the sense that there was no nuclear war yesterday that began. I mean, the economic environment remains the same. All right? So, this is on economic modeling. And, gee, I don't remember anything else that I have for today. Essentially, these were my 3 major topics. Let's see, guys, what questions you may have on, again, economics, macro, the model, the course, or anything else, as I intend to finish for today. Any questions? None? Alright, if you have any questions, simply send me an email, especially if it concerns everybody else. I reply to everybody else. Alright, guys, thank you.